Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives exploration, where tonight we're venturing to the Emerald Isle itself, Ireland. This small island on Europe's western edge has wielded cultural influence far beyond what its size would suggest, producing more Nobel Prize-winning writers per capita than anywhere else on Earth, which frankly is quite impressive for a place that spent centuries convincing everyone it was just about potatoes and rain. From Dublin's literary pubs to the windswept cliffs of Moher, from ancient passage tombs older than Stonehenge to the modern tech corridors of Cork, Ireland's story weaves together Celtic mythology, Norman castles, revolutionary struggles, and one of history's most remarkable economic transformations. We'll trace this journey from the ice sheets that carved its valleys to the peace agreements that ended decades of conflict. Tonight's deep dive will carry you through over 5,000 years of Irish history, the perfect companion for drifting off while learning something genuinely fascinating. If you find yourself still awake by the end, you'll have gained serious bragging rights about Irish trivia. Drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Our community spans the globe, and it's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you're ready to explore every corner of our planet's rich history, that subscribe button is your passport to the full Atlas Archives journey. Now, let's settle into the emerald landscapes and turbulent chronicles of Ireland. Chapter 1: Ancient Ireland and Early Geography. Let's begin our story not with people, but with the very ground beneath their feet. Ireland's geological tale starts around 600 million years ago, when the island was having what geologists call a very complicated relationship status with several different continents. Picture Ireland as that friend who keeps moving apartments. First it was hanging out near the South Pole, then it decided to take a leisurely continental drift up north, collecting rocks and stories along the way like a geological tourist who can't stop buying souvenirs. The island we know today is essentially a giant limestone sandwich with some volcanic filling and a granite crust that's been aged to perfection. The central lowlands, which make up about 60% of the country, sit comfortably below 200 metres above sea level, creating what early settlers probably thought was Ireland's way of saying, "Welcome, please stay a while and grow some crops." These limestone plains were once the bottom of tropical seas, which explains why you can find fossils of ancient sea creatures in the middle of what is now Tipperary. Imagine explaining that to a confused trilobite who woke up from a 400 million year nap to find itself surrounded by sheep instead of seaweed. Around the edges of this comfortable limestone heartland, Ireland decided to show off with some dramatic mountain ranges. The mountains of Kerry and Cork in the southwest stretch their rocky fingers toward the Atlantic, as if the island is trying to hitch a ride to America. These peaks, part of what geologists cheerfully call the Armorican mountain building event, were formed when continents collided with all the subtlety of two shopping trolleys meeting in a supermarket aisle during the Christmas rush. The Wicklow Mountains, south of what would eventually become Dublin, earned the nickname the Garden of Ireland, though early visitors might have questioned this designation after trudging through bog and heather in the rain. These granite uplands rise to over 900 metres at their highest point, creating a landscape so moody and atmospheric that it later inspired countless poets to write verses about mist and longing, usually while sitting in considerably drier locations. But perhaps Ireland's most defining geographical feature isn't its mountains at all, but its relationship with water. The island is surrounded by over 3,000 kilometres of coastline, creating more scenic variety than a postcard shop having an identity crisis. The western coast, where the Atlantic Ocean has been enthusiastically redecorating the shoreline for millennia, features dramatic cliffs, hidden coves, and waves that arrive with all the force of oceanic opinions about coastal architecture. The River Shannon, Ireland's longest river at 366 kilometres, meanders through the landscape like a tourist who's forgotten their map but is enjoying the journey anyway. This watery highway connected communities long before anyone thought to build roads, serving as Ireland's original postal service, transport system, and source of endless debates about fishing rights. The Shannon's lazy loops and curves create a drainage basin covering roughly a fifth of the entire island, making it less of a river and more of a liquid spiderweb connecting half the country. Ireland's climate, influenced by the Gulf Stream's warm embrace and the Atlantic's persistent opinions about weather, created the perfect conditions for the lush greenery that would later make the island famous. The temperate oceanic climate means that temperatures rarely get extremely hot or cold, but precipitation is as reliable as a worried mother asking if you've eaten enough. This consistent dampness, combined with mild temperatures, created landscapes so green that early visitors probably suspected the grass of being professionally dyed. Now, after the ice retreated for the final time around 12,000 years ago, leaving behind a landscape that looked like it had been rearranged by a giant with very strong opinions about interior decorating, the first humans began to arrive. The earliest inhabitants likely made their way across land bridges and short sea crossings from Britain and continental Europe, following herds of animals and perhaps hoping for better weather in a new location, a hope that, let's be honest, they probably should have researched more thoroughly. These Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, arriving around 10,000 years ago, found an island that was essentially a wilderness bed and breakfast, with excellent fishing but limited room service. They lived in temporary camps along rivers and coasts, following seasonal patterns of resources like early ecotourists who really committed to the experience. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mount Sandel in County Londonderry reveals communities that knew how to make the most of Ireland's natural bounty, crafting tools from stone and antler with the practical ingenuity of people who understood that the nearest hardware store was several thousand years in the future. These early Irish inhabitants developed a sophisticated understanding of their environment, reading the landscape like a complicated but ultimately rewarding novel. They knew which trees provided the best wood for tools, which plants could be eaten without causing regrettable consequences, and how to predict animal movements with an accuracy that would make modern wildlife documentarians slightly jealous. Their lifestyle was necessarily nomadic, following resources across seasons in patterns that would have made excellent content for a survival blog, if blogs had existed and if anyone could have read them. The arrival of Neolithic farmers around 4,000 years ago marked Ireland's transition from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural one, though calling this transition smooth would be like calling a donkey ride across rocky terrain, somewhat bumpy. These new arrivals brought with them the revolutionary technologies of crop cultivation and animal domestication, fundamentally changing not just how people lived, but how they shaped the landscape itself. Suddenly, Ireland wasn't just a place to visit seasonally, it was a place to stay, build, and argue with neighbours about property boundaries. The Neolithic period saw the construction of some of Ireland's most enduring monuments, including passage tombs that demonstrate architectural ambitions that would make modern contractors nervous about deadline estimates. Newgrange, built around 3,200 years ago, predates both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, making it older than most celebrity marriages and considerably more durable. This massive circular structure, with its precisely aligned passage that illuminates the inner chamber during the winter solstice, suggests that Neolithic Irish communities had both sophisticated astronomical knowledge and the organisational skills to coordinate a construction project that would have challenged any modern project manager. The monument builders of Neolithic Ireland weren't content with just one impressive structure. They created megalithic complexes across the island, from the Carrowmore tombs in Sligo to the court tombs of the northwest. These weren't just burial sites, they were statements written in stone, declarations that these communities had put down roots deep enough to justify moving enormous rocks around the landscape. Each tomb complex required hundreds of people working in coordination, suggesting social structures sophisticated enough to organize large-scale projects while still finding time to grow crops and raise livestock. Around 2,000 years ago, the Bronze Age arrived in Ireland with all the subtlety of a metallurgical revolution. The discovery and working of copper, and later bronze, transformed Irish society as dramatically as the internet would transform communication thousands of years later. Ireland's copper resources, particularly in counties Cork and Kerry, made the island a significant player in European Bronze Age trade networks. Irish copper axes and gold ornaments have been found across Europe, suggesting that early Irish metalworkers were running what amounted to prehistoric export businesses. The Bronze Age Irish developed a particular talent for goldworking that would have made ancient jewellers weep with professional envy. The elaborate gold torques, lunulae, and other ornaments found in Irish bogs and hoards demonstrate not just technical skill, but an aesthetic sensibility that understood how to make precious metals sing. These weren't just decorative items, they were portable wealth, status symbols, and possibly the Bronze Age equivalent of designer handbags, expensive, impractical for daily use, but absolutely essential for making the right impression at important social gatherings. As Bronze Age communities became more settled and prosperous, they also became more concerned with defence. Hill forts began appearing across the landscape, perched on strategic heights like medieval castles that hadn't quite figured out how to be medieval yet. These fortified settlements, with their earthworks and palisades, suggest that Bronze Age Ireland wasn't always as peaceful as a tourist brochure might imply. Competition for resources, trade routes, and the best farming land probably led to conflicts that would have made excellent subject matter for epic poems, if anyone had been taking notes for future bards. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age in Ireland was more gradual than dramatic, like changing from one television channel to another rather than switching to an entirely different entertainment system. Iron technology arrived around 700 years before the Common Era, but bronze continued to be used for decorative and ceremonial purposes. This wasn't technological conservatism, it was practical appreciation for materials that did their jobs well. Bronze remained superior for certain applications, and Irish craftspeople weren't about to abandon perfectly good techniques just because something newer had arrived. By the time the Iron Age was well established, Ireland was inhabited by Celtic peoples who would fundamentally shape the island's cultural identity for centuries to come. The Celts arrived not as a single invasion force, but as successive waves of migrants, traders and settlers who brought with them languages, customs, and technologies that would blend with existing Irish traditions like ingredients in an elaborate cultural recipe that had been simmering for generations. The Celtic Iron Age in Ireland, spanning from around 700 BCE to the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century CE, saw the development of the cultural foundations that would define Irish identity for millennia. This was the period when Irish mythology took shape, when the island's complex political structures emerged, and when the landscape itself became a text written in earthworks, settlements, and sacred sites that told stories of gods, heroes, and the eternal human struggle to make sense of an often incomprehensible world. And so, as we conclude our first journey through ancient Ireland's geological autobiography and earliest human chapters, we leave our ancestors settling into patterns of life that would echo through centuries. Working with the land rather than against it, creating beauty from available materials and building communities strong enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring, including, as they would eventually discover, visits from considerably less welcome neighbours who would arrive by sea with very different ideas about property ownership and cultural exchange. Chapter 2. Medieval Ireland: Vikings, Normans and Gaelic Kings. As we settle into our beds, let's drift back to a time when longships appeared on the horizon, with all the subtlety of an unwelcome in-law at Christmas dinner, and when Irish politics was so complex it made modern coalition governments look like a straightforward game of checkers. By the time the 8th century dawned, Ireland had developed into a sophisticated patchwork of Celtic kingdoms, each operating under what historians politely call a decentralised political structure, and what everyone else would recognise as organised, ritualised chaos. The island was divided into approximately 150 separate tuatha, petty kingdoms that ranged in size from a few hundred to several thousand people, each ruled by a rí or king, who held authority over what amounted to extended family networks with very strong opinions about territory and cattle ownership. These tuatha were grouped into larger confederations, with the legendary 5/5ths, Ulster, Meath, Leinster, Munster and Connacht, serving as the major political divisions. At the theoretical apex of this system sat the High King, or Ard Rí, based at the Hill of Tara in County Meath. However, calling someone a High King in early medieval Ireland was rather like calling someone the CEO of a company where every department head had their own army and their own ideas about who should really be in charge. The position was more aspirational than authoritative, requiring constant military campaigns to remind subordinate kings who was supposed to be the boss this week. The High Kingship rotated between two major dynastic groups, the Uí dynasties, who controlled much of the northern and central parts of the island, and various southern kingdoms, particularly those of Munster. This system worked about as smoothly as you'd expect from a political arrangement where succession was determined by a combination of bloodline, military strength, and whoever could throw the most convincing inauguration party. The Irish had developed tanistry, an inheritance system that chose the most worthy male member of a royal family to succeed the king, which sounds wonderfully meritocratic until you realise that worthy was often determined by whoever could gather the most supporters with the sharpest swords. Into this delicately balanced world of competing Irish kingdoms came the Vikings, arriving in 795 with all the diplomatic finesse of a hurricane with navigation skills. The first recorded raid hit Rathlin Island off the northeast coast of Ireland, followed quickly by attacks on other coastal monasteries. These early Viking raids followed what historians call a hit-and-run strategy, though smash and grab with boats might be more accurate. The raiders would sweep in from the sea, plunder whatever wasn't nailed down, capture anyone who looked valuable for the slave trade, and disappear back across the waves before local defenders could organise an effective response. The Vikings targeted monasteries not out of any particular religious animosity, but because these were essentially medieval banks, community centres, and libraries rolled into one convenient package. Irish monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries were centres of learning, craft production, and wealth accumulation. They contained precious metals worked into religious artefacts, large quantities of livestock, and concentrations of skilled craftspeople and learned individuals who could be sold as slaves in European markets. For Viking raiders looking to maximise their return on investment in longship construction and crew recruitment, monasteries were simply the most logical targets. Initially, these raids were seasonal affairs. The Vikings would arrive in spring, spend the summer raiding, and returned to Scandinavia before winter made sea travel unnecessarily hazardous. However, by 841 they had established their first permanent bases in Ireland, long forts or ship forts, at strategic locations along rivers and coasts. The most famous of these was established at a ford on the River Liffey, at a place the Irish called Dublin, or Black Pool. This would eventually become Dublin, though at the time it was more like a fortified parking lot for Viking longships with delusions of urban grandeur. The establishment of permanent Viking bases changed the entire dynamic of Irish politics. Suddenly, Irish kings had to deal not just with their traditional rivals from neighbouring Tuatha, but with well-equipped foreign warriors who had excellent boats, international trade connections, and absolutely no interest in following traditional Irish rules about warfare, diplomacy, or proper behaviour at royal banquets. Some Irish rulers responded by forming alliances with the Vikings, hiring them as mercenaries in conflicts with rival Irish kingdoms. Others attempted to drive them out through military force, with varying degrees of success and occasional spectacular failures. The Vikings' military advantages were considerable. They had superior metalworking technology, producing weapons and armour that were often better than Irish equipment. Their ships gave them unprecedented mobility, allowing them to strike at unexpected locations and retreat rapidly when faced with superior numbers. Most importantly, they fought as disciplined units rather than as individual warriors seeking personal glory, giving them significant tactical advantages over traditional Irish forces that relied more on individual prowess and ritualized combat. However, the Irish learned quickly. By the mid-9th century, Irish armies had adapted their tactics to deal with Viking warfare, and several high kings scored significant victories against Viking forces. Miles Secnail I, who ruled from 846 to 862, was particularly successful in campaigns against Viking settlements, earning him recognition as the first Irish king to exercise meaningful authority over much of the island. His victories demonstrated that the Vikings, despite their advantages, could be defeated by well-organised Irish forces operating on familiar terrain. The Viking presence in Ireland was not uniform or continuous. There were periods of intensive raiding followed by decades of relative calm, and the political situation changed dramatically as different Viking leaders rose and fell. The most significant change came in 914, when a new wave of Viking settlers arrived, establishing or re-establishing bases at Dublin, Waterford, Cork, Wexford, and Limerick. These newcomers were different from their predecessors. They came to stay, to build, and to create permanent communities rather than simply seasonal raiding bases. Under leaders like Sitrick Silkbeard, who ruled Dublin for much of the early 11th century, the Viking settlements began to transform into genuine towns, the first urban centres in Irish history. These towns became centres of craft production, international trade, and cultural exchange. Dublin, in particular, developed extensive trade networks reaching across Europe and into Russia and the Middle East. Irish silver, worked into elaborate ornaments, found its way to Scandinavian markets, while foreign goods, technologies, and ideas flowed into Ireland through Viking trading networks. The relationship between Vikings and Irish gradually became more complex and intertwined. Vikings began adopting Irish customs, learning the Irish language, and intermarrying with Irish families. Many Norse settlers converted to Christianity, building churches and integrating into Irish religious communities. By the early 11th century, the distinction between Irish and Viking had become increasingly blurred, with many families combining both traditions in what historians call Hiberno-Norse culture. This cultural blending reached its most dramatic expression in the person of Brian Boru, King of Munster and High King of Ireland from 1002 to 1014. Brian rose to power through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and an apparent gift for making enemies feel like they'd rather be friends. He understood that the Viking settlements, rather than being foreign intrusions to be expelled, had become integral parts of Ireland's political and economic landscape. His approach was not to drive out the Vikings, but to make them his Vikings. Brian's reign represented the high point of early medieval Irish political unity. He managed to extract tribute from Viking towns while maintaining peaceful relations with their merchants and craftsmen. He sponsored church reforms, supported learning and the arts, and created what amounted to Ireland's first functioning national government. However, his success also created opposition. Leinster kings in particular resented Munster's dominance and formed alliances with Dublin Vikings and other discontented groups to challenge Brian's authority. This opposition culminated in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, fought on Good Friday outside Dublin. The battle was a complex affair involving Irish armies from Munster and Connacht facing a coalition of Leinster-Irish, Dublin Vikings and mercenaries from Scotland, Iceland and Norway. Brian's forces won a decisive victory, but Brian himself was killed during or shortly after the battle, along with many other prominent Irish and Viking leaders. His death marked the end of the most successful attempt at Irish political unification before the Norman invasion. The century following Clontarf saw a gradual decline in Viking political independence in Ireland, but not their disappearance. Viking towns continued to prosper as trading centres, and Norse families remained important in Irish politics. The Hiberno-Norse identity became so well established that when new threats appeared, Viking settlers often sided with their Irish neighbours against foreign invaders. That new threat materialised in 1169, when Anglo-Norman knights landed at Bannow Bay in County Wexford, invited by Dermot MacMurrough, the exiled King of Leinster. MacMurrough was a character who would have made excellent material for a medieval soap opera, if soap operas had existed, and if anyone in medieval Ireland had time to watch television between managing cattle raids and avoiding political assassination. He had been driven from his kingdom by a coalition led by the High King Rory O'Connor, largely because of his habit of kidnapping other people's wives, burning monasteries, and generally behaving like a man who had missed several important lessons about diplomatic relations and anger management. MacMurrough's invitation to the Normans was initially a desperate attempt to regain his throne, but it opened doors that would prove impossible to close again. The Normans, Vikings who had conquered and settled in Normandy in northern France, then conquered England in 1066, brought military technologies and organisational methods that gave them significant advantages over both Irish and Hiberno-Norse forces. They fought as heavily armoured cavalry, used professional infantry, and most importantly, they built stone castles that could withstand prolonged sieges. The Norman invasion began modestly. Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice de Prendergast landed with fewer than 500 men, but they achieved remarkable success in their first campaigns. They captured Wexford, restored MacMurrough to power in Leinster, and demonstrated that Norman military methods were devastatingly effective against traditional Irish warfare. This initial success attracted more Norman adventurers, including Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known as Strongbow. Strongbow's involvement transformed what had been a limited mercenary expedition into something approaching a conquest. MacMurrough had promised Strongbow his daughter Aoife in marriage and inheritance of the Kingdom of Leinster, creating a Norman foothold in Irish territory that would prove impossible to dislodge. When MacMurrough died in 1171, Strongbow claimed Leinster and found himself ruling one of Ireland's most important kingdoms. The success of the Norman adventurers alarmed King Henry II of England, who worried that his vassals might establish independent kingdoms in Ireland beyond his control, Henry crossed the Irish Sea in 1171 with a substantial army not to conquer Ireland. He had plenty of territory already, but to ensure that Norman successes in Ireland remained under English royal authority. Many Irish kings, recognising superior force when they saw it, submitted to Henry without resistance. The High King, Rory O'Connor, agreed to hold his remaining territories as a vassal of the English crown. The Norman settlement of Ireland was unlike their conquest of England. Rather than displacing existing populations, the Normans established themselves as a new aristocratic layer over existing Irish social structures. They built castles, founded towns, and introduced new agricultural methods, but they also intermarried with Irish families, learned the Irish language, and gradually adopted many Irish customs. Within a few generations, many Norman families had become what later observers called more Irish than the Irish themselves. This cultural assimilation was facilitated by the Norman system of feudalism, which proved surprisingly compatible with Irish kinship-based social organisation. Norman lords granted land to Irish chiefs who became their vassals, creating hybrid Irish-Norman lordships that combined elements of both traditions. The result was not the replacement of Irish culture by Norman culture, but the creation of a new Anglo-Irish culture that would dominate medieval Ireland for the next several centuries. By the early 13th century, Ireland had been transformed from a collection of independent Celtic kingdoms into a complex feudal territory nominally subject to the English crown. Viking towns had become Anglo-Irish commercial centres. Irish kings had become feudal lords or had been displaced by Norman adventurers. The ancient system of tuatha and high kingship had been replaced by counties, lordships, and colonial administration centred in Dublin Castle. Yet Ireland remained distinctively Irish. Outside the areas of intensive Norman settlement, mainly in the east and southeast, Gaelic culture persisted largely unchanged. Irish law, language, and customs continued in many areas. The Irish Church maintained its distinctive character despite attempted reforms. And as we shall see in our next journey together, the relationship between English authority and Irish identity would continue to evolve in ways that neither Norman conquerors nor Irish kings could have predicted when that first longship appeared on the horizon so many centuries ago. Chapter 3: English Conquest and Colonial Period. By the early 16th century, the Anglo-Irish lordships that had emerged from the Norman conquest had become thoroughly Irish in character, earning them the rather pointed designation Old English, to distinguish them from the new waves of English settlers who would soon arrive. These Anglo-Irish families had intermarried with Gaelic nobility, adopted Irish customs, and developed what could generously be called a relaxed attitude toward English royal authority. The Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare, in particular, had become so effective at running Ireland on behalf of the English crown that they had essentially become the crown's only reliable representatives in much of the country. However, this cosy arrangement came to an abrupt end when silken Thomas Fitzgerald decided in 1535 to rebel against Henry VIII, with all the political acumen of a teenager, staging a dramatic exit from a family dinner. His rebellion gave Henry the excuse he needed to implement what historians call the Tudor Conquest, a systematic campaign to bring all of Ireland under direct English control for the first time since the Norman invasion 4 centuries earlier. Henry's approach was initially diplomatic, employing a policy called surrender and regrant that sounds like a medieval real estate transaction, but was actually a clever piece of legal engineering. Irish chiefs were invited to surrender their Gaelic titles and lands to the crown. which would then re-grant them back as English nobility with English titles, English law and English obligations. Con Bacash O'Neill, the most powerful Gaelic lord in Ulster, submitted to Henry in 1542, kneeling before the king and receiving in return the title Earl of Tyrone, along with what contemporary accounts describe as rich robes of gold and satin that must have made him look like a Christmas ornament at formal occasions. The policy had the advantage of appearing consensual while fundamentally transforming the legal basis of landholding in Ireland. Where once chiefs had held territory through ancient Gaelic law and tribal relationships, they now held it as feudal grants from the English crown, subject to English law and English concepts of inheritance. It was a bit like convincing someone to sign a mortgage by telling them they could continue living in their own house, only to discover later that the bank now owned everything and had very specific ideas about renovations. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity when Henry declared himself head of the Church of England and, by extension, the Church of Ireland. The Irish Parliament dutifully passed the necessary legislation in 1536, though convincing Irish clergy and population to abandon Catholicism proved considerably more challenging than changing the letterhead on official documents. The dissolution of Irish monasteries that followed provided the Crown with valuable lands to redistribute, but also created a vast population of displaced monks, nuns, and religious communities who were unlikely to become enthusiastic supporters of the new religious order. Under Henry's successors, particularly Elizabeth I, the conquest became more systematic and considerably more violent. The Crown began implementing plantation schemes, organised colonisation projects that removed Irish landowners and replaced them with Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. The first major plantation was attempted in Loire and Offaly in the 1550s, creating Queen's County and King's County, with all the subtlety of medieval urban planning. These early plantations met with mixed success, partly because Irish chiefs had surprisingly strong opinions about having their ancestral lands redistributed to strangers who couldn't pronounce their names correctly. The Desmond rebellions of 1569 to 73 and 1579 to 83 demonstrated just how violently the conquest could become. The Second Desmond Rebellion in particular was suppressed with methods that would make modern military lawyers reach for their strongest coffee. English forces under Sir Arthur Grey employed what they called scorched earth tactics, which involved burning crops, killing livestock, and creating artificial famines designed to starve rebel territories into submission. Contemporary reports suggest that up to a third of Munster's population died, either from fighting or from the deliberate famine that followed. The Crown's response to this devastation was to implement the Munster Plantation, redistributing confiscated Desmond lands to English undertakers who promised to bring in Protestant settlers and create a loyal, English-speaking population. Among the beneficiaries was a minor English gentleman named Walter Raleigh, who received 42,000 acres and probably thought he had made out rather well, considering his later career difficulties involving the Tower of London and an executioner's axe. The most determined resistance came from Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who had been raised in England as a royal ward and educated in the finest traditions of English nobility. This turned out to be rather like training a potential opponent in all your military techniques and political strategies, then sending them home with detailed knowledge of your weaknesses and a comprehensive understanding of exactly why they should resent you. O'Neill proved to be a formidable opponent, combining traditional Irish guerrilla tactics with modern military technology and European diplomatic connections. The 9 Years' War, 1593 to 1603, represented the final and most serious challenge to English conquest. O'Neill allied with Hugh O'Donnell of Tyrconnell and received military support from Spain, creating what amounted to an international coalition against English rule. The Irish victory at the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598 demonstrated that English forces could be defeated even when employing the most modern military techniques available. However, Spanish support arrived too little and too late. The Spanish expedition landed at Kinsale in 1601, but was besieged by English forces before it could effectively combine with Irish armies. O'Neill's attempt to relieve the Spanish garrison ended in defeat, and with it, organised Irish resistance to the Tudor conquest collapsed. O'Neill and his allies were treated with relative generosity. They were allowed to retain their titles and much of their land, perhaps because the English had developed a healthy respect for the costs of continued warfare in Ireland. Yet this generosity proved temporary. In 1607, O'Neill, O'Donnell, and other prominent Ulster lords departed Ireland in what became known as the Flight of the Earls. Whether they left voluntarily or under pressure remains debated, but their departure left Ulster's Gaelic nobility effectively leaderless and provided the Crown with the opportunity for its most ambitious plantation scheme yet. The Ulster Plantation, launched after 1609, was designed to be more systematic and successful than previous colonisation efforts. The Crown confiscated some 4 million acres of prime Ulster land and redistributed it to English and Scottish undertakers, who agreed to bring in Protestant settlers, build defensible settlements, and create a loyal colonial population. Unlike earlier plantations, which often failed because insufficient numbers of settlers could be recruited, the Ulster Plantation succeeded in attracting substantial numbers of Scottish Presbyterians, fleeing economic difficulties and religious persecution in Scotland. These Presbyterian settlers, who would later become known as the Scots-Irish, brought with them a particular brand of Calvinist Protestantism that was almost as suspicious of Anglican authority as it was of Catholic tradition. They also brought advanced agricultural techniques, commercial skills, and a work ethic that would have impressed modern corporate efficiency experts. Within a generation, Ulster had been transformed from a Gaelic countryside into a landscape of planned towns, improved farms and fortified settlements that looked more like lowland Scotland than traditional Ireland. The success of the Ulster Plantation created a new dynamic in Irish society, a three-way division between the Gaelic Irish majority, the Old English Catholic minority, and the New English and Scottish Protestant colonists. Each group had different languages, religions, legal traditions, and political loyalties, creating what political scientists would recognise as a classic recipe for ethnic conflict. These tensions erupted dramatically in 1641, when Irish Catholics launched what they claimed was a defensive uprising to protect their remaining lands and religious freedom, but which quickly escalated into something approaching a general massacre of Protestant settlers. Contemporary accounts, many admittedly written by survivors with understandable bias, describe attacks on Protestant communities that killed thousands of settlers and drove many more from their homes. The exact death toll remains disputed, but English Protestant opinion was convinced that Irish Catholics had attempted systematic extermination of the Protestant population. The 1641 rebellion created a crisis that the English government, already engaged in civil war, was initially unable to address. Irish Catholics formed the Catholic Confederation, essentially an independent Irish government based in Kilkenny, and allied themselves with King Charles I's royalist forces. For nearly a decade, Ireland became a three-way battleground between Irish Catholic Confederates, English Protestant parliamentarians, and Scottish Presbyterian Covenanters, with various royalist forces shifting between different alliances as circumstances dictated. Into this chaos came Oliver Cromwell in 1649, fresh from victories in the English Civil War, and convinced that Irish Catholics bore collective responsibility for the massacre of Protestant settlers 8 years earlier. Cromwell's Irish campaign lasted only 9 months, but it established a reputation for brutality that would echo through Irish popular memory for centuries. His siege and sack of Drogheda in September 1649 resulted in the deaths of over 3,000 defenders and civilians, many killed after surrendering or seeking sanctuary in churches. The massacre at Drogheda was not an unfortunate accident or momentary loss of military discipline. Cromwell ordered that no quarter be given to anyone bearing arms, and his soldiers systematically executed prisoners, burned churches with people inside them, and killed anyone found wearing clerical clothing. Sir Arthur Aston, the English royalist commander of the garrison, was beaten to death with his own wooden leg, demonstrating that Cromwell's forces made little distinction between Irish Catholics and English royalists when it came to creative violence. A month later, similar scenes unfolded at Wexford, where Cromwell's forces stormed the town while surrender negotiations were supposedly in progress. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers hunting down civilians in the streets, burning churches, and conducting what modern international law would classify as war crimes. At least 2,000 people died in what witnesses described as an orgy of religiously motivated violence. Cromwell justified these atrocities by claiming they would prevent greater bloodshed by terrorising other Irish towns into surrender. This proved partially correct. Several towns surrendered immediately rather than risk similar treatment, but it also had the opposite effect of convincing many Irish Catholics that they would be killed even if they surrendered, thereby prolonging resistance and making the conquest more, rather than less, bloody. The Cromwellian conquest was completed by 1653, but its consequences extended far beyond military victory. The English Parliament passed the Act of Settlement in 1652, which confiscated the lands of all Catholics who had participated in the rebellion, as well as many who had remained neutral or even supported the government. Dispossessed Catholics were offered the choice of relocating to Connacht, the poorest and most remote province, or transportation to the Caribbean as indentured servants. The land confiscations were staggering in scale. Catholic land ownership, which had been about 60% of the total before 1641, fell to around 8% by 1660. The confiscated lands were redistributed to English soldiers, Protestant settlers, and investors who had financed the conquest through the Adventurers Act, essentially a speculative scheme that allowed English merchants to gamble on Irish real estate with other people's lives as collateral. The human cost was equally devastating. Historians estimate that Ireland's population fell by at least 25% between 1641 and 1653, with deaths from warfare, famine, disease, and transportation creating what some scholars have characterized as a demographic catastrophe. Entire communities were destroyed, ancient Gaelic noble families disappeared, and the cultural landscape of Ireland was fundamentally altered. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 raised Catholic hopes that the Cromwellian settlement might be reversed, but these hopes were disappointed. While Charles made some individual grants to Catholic supporters who had shared his exile, he confirmed the basic structure of the Cromwellian land settlement. The Catholic landowning class that survived was largely confined to Connacht, and even there they faced constant pressure from Protestant neighbours and colonial administrators. The final phase of Catholic dispossession came after the Williamite War of 1688–91, when Irish Catholics backed the deposed James II against William of Orange. Their defeat at the Battle of the Boyne and subsequent battles led to another round of land confiscations and the imposition of what became known as the Penal Laws, a comprehensive legal code designed to exclude Catholics from political, economic and social power permanently. The Penal Laws, enacted between 1695 and 1728, were perhaps the most systematic attempt at legal oppression in European history. Catholics were excluded from Parliament, the legal profession, the army, and most public offices. They could not vote, hold arms, own horses worth more than £5, or send their children abroad for education. Catholic clergy were banished, Catholic schools were prohibited, and Catholic marriages to Protestants were declared invalid. Perhaps most devastatingly, the penal laws attacked Catholic property rights through a system designed to gradually transfer all remaining Catholic land to Protestant ownership. Catholics could not buy land from Protestants, lease land for more than 31 years, or bequeath estates intact to their heirs. When a Catholic landowner died, his property had to be divided equally among all his sons, unless the eldest converted to Protestantism, in which case he could inherit the entire estate. These laws were enforced selectively. Mass enforcement would have been economically disruptive and practically impossible, but they created a legal framework that allowed Protestant neighbours, business competitors, or personal enemies to attack successful Catholics through the courts. Edmund Burke, himself of Catholic background, described the penal laws as a machine as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. The result was the creation of what became known as the Protestant ascendancy, a colonial ruling class that controlled virtually all political power, economic resources, and social institutions in Ireland. By 1770, Catholics owned less than 5% of Irish land. Despite comprising over 75% of the population, Protestant families controlled Parliament, the courts, local government, and the established church, creating what amounted to an apartheid system centuries before the term was invented. Yet the penal laws also had unintended consequences. By forcing Catholics to develop alternative economic networks, they inadvertently encouraged the growth of a Catholic merchant class that operated through informal credit systems and international trade connections. Catholics excluded from the legal profession became involved in commerce, medicine, and manufacturing. Those denied access to Trinity College pursued education in European universities, creating connections between Ireland and continental European intellectual life. More importantly, the shared experience of legal oppression began to create a common Catholic Irish identity that transcended the traditional divisions between Gaelic Irish and Old English families. Where 16th century Ireland had been divided into numerous competing ethnic, linguistic, and political groups, 18th century Ireland increasingly polarised along religious lines, with a Protestant colonial minority ruling over a Catholic colonial majority that was beginning to develop a sense of shared nationality. Chapter 4: The Path to Independence. By the early 19th century, the Protestant ascendancy's grip on Irish society seemed unshakable, but the very completeness of their dominance had created the conditions for its eventual overthrow. The penal laws had succeeded in concentrating political and economic power in Protestant hands, but they had also created a shared sense of grievance among the Catholic majority that transcended the traditional divisions between Gaelic Irish and Old English families. Into this volatile situation stepped Daniel O'Connell, a Kerry lawyer who would fundamentally transform Irish politics through what he called moral force, the strategic application of mass popular pressure within the constraints of constitutional legality. O'Connell was uniquely positioned to bridge Ireland's multiple divides. Born into a Gaelic-speaking Catholic family that had retained some wealth despite the penal laws, educated in France during the Revolution, and trained as a barrister in London, he understood both Irish popular culture and British political institutions. His political genius lay in recognizing that the Catholic majority's greatest weapon was their numbers, if they could be organized and disciplined into a coherent political force. The Catholic Association, founded by O'Connell in 1823, revolutionized Irish politics by creating the world's first mass democratic movement. The association's innovation was the Catholic rent, a monthly subscription of 1 penny that allowed even the poorest tenant farmer to become a member of a national political organisation. This sounds modest by modern standards, but it represented a radical democratisation of political participation in a society where political activity had previously been confined to property-owning elites. Within a few years, the Catholic Association had enrolled hundreds of thousands of members and was raising substantial funds from across Catholic Ireland. More importantly, it had created a political network that reached into every parish, linking illiterate farmers in remote townlands with middle-class activists in Dublin through a chain of communication that bypassed traditional authority structures. The Catholic clergy, recognising both the moral legitimacy and practical benefits of the campaign, provided crucial organisational support and lent their moral authority to what might otherwise have appeared as a revolutionary movement. O'Connell's masterstroke came in 1828 when he stood for Parliament in County Clare, despite being legally barred from taking his seat as a Catholic. His campaign attracted massive crowds and demonstrated the power of organised Catholic opinion in ways that terrified both local Protestant landlords and the British government. When O'Connell won by an overwhelming majority, it created a constitutional crisis. He had been legally elected, but could not legally serve, creating a situation that threatened to make British rule in Ireland unworkable. Faced with the prospect of massive civil unrest and the practical collapse of the electoral system in Catholic areas, the government of the Duke of Wellington reluctantly passed the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. The Act removed most legal barriers to Catholic participation in British political life, allowing Catholics to become MPs, judges, and senior military officers for the first time since the 17th century. It was a stunning victory that demonstrated how sustained popular pressure could force even the most reluctant government to make fundamental constitutional changes. However, Catholic emancipation came with significant restrictions that revealed the limits of British concessions to Irish demands. The Act raised the property qualification for voting, eliminating many of the small farmers who had formed the backbone of O'Connell's support. It also required MPs to take an oath that, while acceptable to Catholics, excluded Jews and effectively limited Catholic political advancement. Most importantly, it did nothing to address the fundamental economic and social grievances that animated Irish Catholic resentment. O'Connell's next campaign targeted the Act of Union itself, demanding the restoration of an Irish Parliament under the British Crown, a policy known as repeal of the Union. This proved more difficult than Catholic emancipation because it challenged the fundamental structure of British control in Ireland rather than simply removing discriminatory barriers to Irish participation in existing institutions. Nevertheless, O'Connell's monster meetings of the 1840s attracted crowds estimated at hundreds of thousands, demonstrating that Irish popular opinion was becoming increasingly radicalised. The repeal campaign's climax came at Clontarf in 1843, where O'Connell planned to hold a meeting expected to attract over 1 million people. When the government banned the meeting and deployed military forces to prevent it, O'Connell faced the defining choice of his political career. True to his principles of non-violence, he called off the meeting rather than risk bloodshed, but this decision fatally weakened his credibility with more militant nationalists, who concluded that constitutional methods alone would never achieve Irish independence. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 fundamentally transformed Irish society and politics in ways that made O'Connell's constitutional nationalism increasingly obsolete. The famine was caused by potato blight, a fungal infection that destroyed Ireland's potato crops for several consecutive years, but its devastating human impact reflected the vulnerability created by Ireland's colonial economic structure and the inadequacy of British government responses. Ireland's dependence on the potato was itself a product of the colonial land system. Catholic tenant farmers, excluded from owning land and forced to rent tiny plots at high rents, had turned to the potato because it was the only crop that could sustain a family on a small acreage. The potato also had the advantage of being difficult for landlords to seize for rent, since it was stored underground and harvested as needed. By 1845, roughly 3 million Irish people, about 40% of the population, were almost entirely dependent on potatoes for survival. When the blight struck, it created an immediate crisis for this vulnerable population. The first year's failure caused hardship but not mass starvation, partly because the government of Sir Robert Peel responded with emergency imports of Indian corn and public works projects to provide employment. However, when the Whig government of Lord John Russell took office in 1846, it implemented policies based on free market ideology and anti-Irish prejudice that transformed a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. The Russell government's response was characterised by what modern observers would recognise as ideological rigidity combined with ethnic prejudice. British officials convinced themselves that the famine was divine punishment for Irish moral failings, and that excessive government intervention would create dependency and undermine the operation of natural economic laws. They terminated Peel's relief programmes, refused to interfere with food exports from Ireland, and implemented a system of workhouse relief designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that 1 million people died from starvation and famine-related diseases, while another million emigrated, many under conditions so harsh that the ships carrying them became known as coffin ships. Entire communities disappeared. The Irish language suffered irreversible decline, and the social fabric of rural Ireland was fundamentally altered. The demographic impact was so severe that Ireland's population, which had been growing rapidly before the famine, did not return to pre-famine levels for over a century. Perhaps more importantly for the long-term development of Irish nationalism, the famine created a shared folk memory of British callousness that would influence Irish attitudes toward British rule for generations. The image of food exports leaving Irish ports while Irish people starved became a powerful nationalist narrative that made constitutional cooperation with British authorities increasingly difficult to justify to Irish popular opinion. The famine also accelerated Irish emigration to North America, creating an Irish diaspora that would provide crucial financial and political support for future nationalist movements. Irish Americans, carrying memories of famine and dispossession, became a powerful lobby for Irish independence in American politics and a source of funding for Irish revolutionary organisations. This international dimension gave Irish nationalism resources and leverage that previous resistance movements had lacked. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, Irish politics was dominated by the emergence of new organisations that rejected O'Connell's commitment to constitutional methods. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in 1858, was a secret revolutionary organisation committed to achieving an independent Irish republic through armed rebellion. Drawing inspiration from continental European revolutionary movements, the IRB developed a cell-based structure designed to evade police surveillance and planned to coordinate Irish revolution with British involvement in foreign wars. The IRB's first major attempt at revolution came in 1867 with the Fenian Rising, which failed due to poor coordination, government infiltration, and lack of popular support. However, the Fenian movement established the template for future Irish revolutionary organisations and created a romantic mythology of heroic failure that would inspire later generations of rebels. The public executions of Fenian prisoners in Manchester created additional martyrs for the nationalist cause and demonstrated that British authorities had learned little from the counterproductive consequences of their response to previous Irish uprisings. The late 19th century saw the emergence of the Home Rule movement, which attempted to revive O'Connell's constitutional approach under the leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell. The Irish Parliamentary Party, representing the vast majority of Irish constituencies after franchise reform, used its balance of power position in the House of Commons to extract concessions from British governments in exchange for supporting their legislative programmes. Parnell's political genius lay in combining parliamentary pressure with implicit threats of revolutionary violence, creating what he called a policy of holding the balance. The Irish Parliamentary Party's disciplined bloc of 80-plus MPs could make or break British governments, giving Ireland unprecedented political leverage. At the same time, Parnell maintained connections with more militant nationalists while publicly condemning their methods, creating uncertainty about Ireland's future that encouraged British politicians to take Irish demands seriously. The Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893 brought Ireland closer to self-government than it had been since the Union, but both were defeated by the House of Lords and by British Conservative opposition that exploited Protestant Ulster's fears of Catholic domination. The Home Rule crisis revealed the fundamental contradictions in British liberalism's approach to Ireland. British politicians were willing to grant Ireland limited self-government, but unwilling to coerce the Protestant minority into accepting it. The Third Home Rule Bill, passed in 1914, seemed to promise Irish self-government at last, but its implementation was suspended due to the outbreak of World War I. This delay proved fatal to constitutional nationalism because it provided militant Republicans with the opportunity to demonstrate that British promises of gradual reform could not be trusted. The Easter Rising of 1916 was planned by a small group of IRB leaders who understood that their rebellion was likely to fail militarily, but hoped it would have educational and inspirational value for future nationalist movements. Patrick Pearse, the Rising's chief ideologist, explicitly embraced what he called the pedagogy of the sword, the idea that heroic sacrifice in a hopeless cause could awaken Irish national consciousness more effectively than practical political success. The Rising itself was a military failure that lasted only 6 days and initially received little public support from Dublin's population, who were more concerned with the disruption to their daily lives than with abstract principles of Irish independence. However, the British military response, and particularly the execution of 16 rebel leaders, transformed public opinion and gave the nationalist movement the martyrs that Pearse had sought. The Rising's most important long-term consequence was to discredit constitutional nationalism and create space for more radical alternatives. In the 1918 election, the militant Republican Party, Sinn Féin, won 73 of Ireland's 105 seats, effectively destroying the Irish Parliamentary Party that had dominated nationalist politics for 40 years. Rather than take their seats at Westminster, the Sinn Féin MPs established their own parliament, Dáil Éireann, in Dublin, and declared Irish independence. The War of Independence that followed from 1919 to 1921 represented a new form of Irish resistance that combined political and military strategies under the leadership of figures like Michael Collins. Collins, who had learned from the tactical failures of the Easter Rising, developed a guerrilla campaign that targeted British intelligence networks and made effective British administration increasingly difficult. Collins's strategy was based on the recognition that Ireland could not defeat Britain in conventional warfare, but could make British rule so costly and politically embarrassing that British opinion would eventually support withdrawal. The IRA's campaign of selective assassination and ambush was calibrated to provoke British reprisals that would alienate moderate Irish opinion, while avoiding the kind of mass confrontation that British forces could easily suppress. The British government's response, particularly the deployment of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, hastily recruited ex-soldiers with limited training and poor discipline, played directly into Collins's strategy by creating a cycle of violence that made the Irish situation an increasing embarrassment for British political leaders. By 1921, the costs of maintaining control over Ireland had become unsustainable, leading to negotiations that would create the Irish Free State and fundamentally transform the relationship between Britain and Ireland. Chapter 5. Modern Ireland. Republic and Troubles. The Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations of 1921 created what Michael Collins famously called the freedom to achieve freedom. But this freedom came with a price that would split the Irish independence movement and plunge the new state into civil war. The treaty, signed on December 6, 1921, established the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Commonwealth, with the same status as Canada or Australia. However, it also confirmed the partition of Ireland, allowing the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and required Irish parliamentarians to swear an oath of fidelity to the British Crown. The treaty negotiations had been conducted without President Eamon de Valera, who remained in Dublin ostensibly to provide political cover for whatever compromise the negotiators might reach. The Irish delegation, led by Arthur Griffith and Collins, they found themselves trapped between British threats of immediate war if they rejected the treaty and their own republican principles that demanded nothing less than a fully independent Irish republic. Lloyd George's ultimatum that the delegates sign the treaty or face terrible and immediate war left them with an impossible choice that would haunt Irish politics for generations. When the Dáil debated the treaty in January 1922, the arguments revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of Irish nationalism and the relationship between political pragmatism and revolutionary idealism. Collins argued that the treaty provided a stepping stone to full independence, noting that no British politician would ever again be able to claim authority over Ireland without Irish consent. De Valera countered that accepting the treaty meant betraying the republic proclaimed in 1916 and abandoning the ideal of complete independence for a comfortable but subordinate status within the British Empire. The Dáil approved the treaty by the narrow margin of 64 votes to 57, but this slim majority masked deep divisions that extended far beyond parliamentary politics. The Irish Republican Army split, with most units rejecting the treaty and the authority of the new provisional government. Sinn Féin fractured along similar lines, creating parallel political organisations that would dominate Irish politics for the next century. Even families divided, with brothers often finding themselves on opposite sides of what became known as the Split. The civil war that followed from 1922 to 1923 was more bitter and destructive than the War of Independence had been, partly because former comrades were now killing each other over questions of principle rather than territory. The conflict began when anti-treaty forces occupied the Four Courts building in Dublin, establishing a rival centre of authority that challenged the provisional government's legitimacy. Collins, under British pressure to restore order, reluctantly ordered the bombardment of the Four Courts. beginning a conflict that would cost more lives than the previous war against Britain. The Civil War's casualty list included Collins himself, killed in an ambush at Béal na Bláth in County Cork in August 1922. His death deprived the Free State of its most charismatic leader and left the pro-treaty forces under the leadership of less experienced politicians like William Cosgrave and Kevin O'Higgins. The government's response to the continuing conflict became increasingly harsh, with 77 official executions of anti-treaty prisoners, including former cabinet ministers and prominent Republican leaders. The anti-treaty forces, led politically by de Valera and militarily by figures like Liam Lynch and Ernie O'Malley, fought a guerrilla campaign that gradually lost popular support as the Free State government demonstrated its ability to maintain order and provide basic services. The Catholic Church's support for the provisional government and condemnation of Republican irregulars further isolated the anti-treaty side. By May 1923, the Republicans had called a ceasefire and ordered their fighters to dump arms rather than surrender, maintaining the fiction that they remained the legitimate army of the Irish Republic. The Civil War's aftermath left Irish society deeply scarred, with divisions that would persist for generations. The two main political parties that emerged from the conflict, Fine Gael from the pro-treaty side and Fianna Fáil from the anti-treaty Republicans, represented not just different policy positions but different conceptions of Irish nationalism and legitimacy. The personal bitterness was so intense that veterans of opposing sides often refused to speak to each other for decades, and their children inherited these animosities along with family names that immediately identified their Civil War allegiances. The Irish Free State that emerged from the Civil War was a conservative, largely rural society dominated by Catholic social teaching and suspicious of modernising influences from abroad. The new constitution, adopted in 1922, established a parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster model, but with significant restrictions that reflected both British pressure and conservative Irish Catholic opinion. The state initially functioned as a dominion of the British Empire, with the Governor-General representing the Crown and ultimate sovereignty residing in London. However, Collins's prediction that the treaty would provide the freedom to achieve freedom proved accurate, as successive Irish governments gradually dismantled the constitutional limitations imposed by the treaty. Under Cosgrave's Cumann na Engéidheal government during the 1920s, Ireland secured separate representation at the League of Nations, established its own diplomatic service, and began asserting independence in international affairs. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 formally recognised dominion equality within the Commonwealth, providing legal justification for further Irish moves towards sovereignty. The most dramatic expansion of Irish independence came after 1932, when Fianna Fáil, led by de Valera, won power for the first time. De Valera, the former opponent of the treaty, now used its constitutional framework to systematically dismantle British authority in Ireland. He abolished the Oath of Allegiance, removed the Governor-General from any meaningful role, and initiated the economic war with Britain by withholding the land annuities that the treaty required Ireland to pay. The new constitution adopted in 1937 completed Ireland's transition to de facto independence by declaring the state's sovereignty over the entire island of Ireland, while establishing a republic in all but name. The constitution created the office of President as head of state, established Irish as the first official language, and included Catholic social teaching as the basis for much domestic legislation. Only the continuing use of the title Irish Free State and membership in the Commonwealth maintained the pretense of constitutional connection to Britain. World War II provided the final test of Irish independence when de Valera declared Ireland neutral despite intense pressure from both Britain and Germany. Irish neutrality was not merely symbolic. German U-boats operated from Irish bases, while British intelligence services were denied access to Irish facilities. The policy proved enormously popular with Irish public opinion and demonstrated that Ireland was truly sovereign, able to make decisions based on Irish interests rather than imperial obligations. Ireland finally declared itself a republic in 1949 under John A. Costello's coalition government, formally ending the last constitutional connections to Britain and withdrawing from the Commonwealth. The Ireland Act passed by the British Parliament in response guaranteed that Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom unless its Parliament consented to Irish unity, effectively copper-fastening partition while acknowledging Irish sovereignty over the 26 counties. Meanwhile, Northern Ireland had developed along very different lines since partition in 1921. The new state, consisting of 6 counties with a Protestant majority, was designed to be a Protestant state for a Protestant people, as its first Prime Minister, James Craig, openly declared. The Ulster Unionist Party governed continuously from 1921 to 1972, maintaining Protestant political dominance through a combination of gerrymandered electoral boundaries, discriminatory employment practices, and exclusion of Catholics from positions of authority. The Northern Ireland state's legitimacy was always contested by its substantial Catholic minority, who comprised about 1/3 of the population but held virtually no political power. Catholics faced systematic discrimination in employment, housing allocation, and local government representation. The system of local government voting, which restricted the franchise to property owners, effectively disenfranchised many Catholics while giving multiple votes to Protestant business owners. The result was a political system that looked democratic in form, but operated as a Protestant ascendancy in practice. For nearly 50 years, this system maintained relative stability through a combination of economic development, emigration of discontented Catholics, and the political marginalisation of nationalist opposition. The Irish government, preoccupied with its own development and wary of provoking conflict, generally avoided direct challenges to Northern Ireland's internal arrangements while maintaining the constitutional claim to sovereignty over the 6 counties. The situation began to change dramatically during the 1960s, when a new generation of Catholic civil rights activists, inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, began demanding equal treatment within Northern Ireland rather than seeking immediate Irish unification. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, founded in 1967, organised peaceful marches and protests demanding one person, one vote in local elections, an end to housing discrimination, and the disbandment of the controversial B Special Auxiliary Police Force. The civil rights movement's peaceful protests met with violent opposition from loyalist counter-demonstrators and heavy-handed responses from the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Television coverage of police batoning peaceful protesters in Derry in October 1968 shocked international opinion and put the Northern Ireland government under unprecedented pressure to reform. However, every concession to Catholic demands provoked Protestant backlash, while continued discrimination convinced many Catholics that peaceful protest would never achieve meaningful change. The deployment of British troops in August 1969, initially welcomed by Catholics as protection from loyalist attacks, marked the beginning of what became known as the Troubles, a 30-year conflict that would claim over 3,500 lives. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, formed in 1969 from a split in the older IRA, launched an armed campaign to end British rule in Northern Ireland and force Irish unification. Loyalist paramilitary organisations responded with their own campaigns of violence aimed at defending the Union and intimidating the Catholic community. The conflict escalated dramatically after Bloody Sunday in January 1972, when British paratroopers shot dead 14 unarmed Catholic civilians during a civil rights march in Derry. The killings destroyed any remaining Catholic faith in British justice and provided the IRA with a massive recruitment surge. The British government's response was to suspend the Northern Ireland Parliament and impose direct rule from London, effectively admitting that the Unionist-dominated system had failed. The next 3 decades saw repeated attempts to find a political solution while the violence continued. The IRA's campaign of bombings and assassinations targeted British forces, Protestant civilians, and economic infrastructure, while loyalist paramilitaries retaliated with sectarian murders and attacks on Catholic areas. British forces, deployed ostensibly as peacekeepers, found themselves fighting a counterinsurgency campaign against Republican paramilitaries while trying to maintain order between hostile communities. Various peace initiatives founded on the fundamental incompatibility of Republican demands for Irish unity and Unionist insistence on maintaining the Union with Britain. The Sunningdale Agreement of 1973 collapsed after a Loyalist general strike, while the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 provoked massive Unionist resistance despite offering them continued British sovereignty. Each failure strengthened extremist voices on both sides and made subsequent compromise more difficult. The breakthrough came gradually during the 1990s, as a new generation of political leaders on all sides recognized that military victory was impossible and the costs of continued conflict were becoming unsustainable. Secret contacts between the British government and the IRA, facilitated by Irish government intermediaries, explored the possibility of Republican participation in constitutional politics in exchange for prisoner releases and political reform. The IRA ceasefire of August 1994, followed by Loyalist ceasefires, created the political space for inclusive negotiations involving all parties. American involvement, particularly through Senator George Mitchell's chairmanship of the talks, provided crucial external mediation and pressure for agreement. The election of Tony Blair's Labour government in 1997 brought new energy to the peace process, with Blair and Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern working closely to overcome remaining obstacles. The Good Friday Agreement, signed on April 10, 1998, established the framework for a lasting peace based on the principle of consent, that Northern Ireland's constitutional status could only change with the agreement of a majority of its people. The agreement created new power-sharing institutions that required cooperation between Unionist and nationalist parties, while also establishing North-South institutions linking Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland and East-West institutions connecting the islands of Britain and Ireland. The agreement was overwhelmingly endorsed in simultaneous referendums, with 94% support in the Republic of Ireland and 71% in Northern Ireland. However, the Protestant vote in Northern Ireland was much closer, with only 52% supporting the agreement, indicating that implementing the peace would require sustained effort to maintain cross-community support. The subsequent decades have seen periodic crises and institutional collapses, but the basic framework has held, and violence has remained at historically low levels. The peace process transformed both parts of Ireland in ways that would have been unimaginable during the Troubles. Northern Ireland developed functioning power-sharing institutions that brought together former enemies in government, while the Republic of Ireland abandoned its territorial claim to Northern Ireland and accepted partition as a legitimate expression of Unionist identity. Both states joined the European Union, creating new frameworks for cooperation that transcended traditional national divisions and offered alternative models for Irish unity that did not require the elimination of British identity in Ireland. Chapter 6. Contemporary Ireland: Geography, Culture and Future. The transformation of Ireland from one of Western Europe's poorest countries to a modern, prosperous nation represents one of the most dramatic economic success stories of the late 20th century. The Celtic Tiger period, which began in the mid-1990s and continued until the global financial crisis of 2008, fundamentally altered Ireland's place in the world and its own sense of national identity. This economic miracle transformed a country that had been synonymous with emigration, poverty, and economic dependency into a magnet for foreign investment, immigration, and international recognition. The roots of Ireland's economic transformation lay in strategic decisions made during the 1960s and 70s, when successive governments abandoned the protectionist policies that had characterized the early decades of independence. The decision to join the European Economic Community in 1973 provided access to continental markets previously reached only through Britain, while massive EU structural funds helped modernise Ireland's infrastructure and educational system. Low corporate tax rates, initially set at 10% for manufacturing and later standardised at 12.5%, attracted multinational corporations seeking a foothold in the European market. American technology companies led the charge, with Intel, Microsoft, Dell, and dozens of other Fortune 500 corporations, establishing European headquarters in Ireland during the 1980s and 90s. The pharmaceutical sector followed, drawn by Ireland's skilled English-speaking workforce, favourable regulatory environment, and strategic location. By 2000, Ireland had become the world's largest exporter of software and the second largest exporter of pharmaceuticals. Remarkable achievements for a country with barely 4 million people. The social transformation accompanying this economic boom was equally dramatic. For the first time in modern history, Ireland experienced net immigration rather than emigration, with Polish, Lithuanian, and other European workers arriving to fill labour shortages. The population, which had declined almost continuously since the Great Famine, began growing rapidly, increasing from 3.5 million in 1990 to over 4.5 million by 2010. Dublin, in particular, transformed from a provincial backwater into a cosmopolitan European capital, complete with traffic jams, high-rise apartments, and multicultural neighbourhoods. The Celtic Tiger also brought fundamental changes to Irish society and culture. Traditional rural communities gave way to suburban sprawl, as prosperity enabled massive house-building programs. Shopping centres replaced village shops, foreign restaurants challenged the dominance of traditional Irish cuisine, and conspicuous consumption became a mark of the new Ireland. The jumbo breakfast roll, eaten by construction workers grabbing food at petrol stations, became an unlikely symbol of the boom's frenetic pace and changing lifestyle patterns. However, the Celtic Tiger's success contained the seeds of its own destruction. After 2000, easy credit from European banks and artificially low interest rates following Euro membership fueled a property bubble that divorced house prices from economic reality. Construction became an increasingly large portion of the economy, employing over 300,000 people at the bubble's peak. Banks lent recklessly to property developers, while ordinary families borrowed enormous sums to buy houses whose prices seemed to increase endlessly. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed the underlying fragility of Ireland's boom. Property prices collapsed, construction stopped virtually overnight, and the banking system faced insolvency. The government's decision to guarantee all bank deposits and debts transformed a private banking crisis into a sovereign debt crisis that required an €85 billion bailout from the European Union and international monetary fund. In 2010, unemployment soared from 4% to 15%, emigration resumed, and the national debt ballooned to over 120% of GDP. Yet Ireland's recovery from this crisis demonstrated the underlying strengths developed during the Celtic Tiger years. The multinational sector remained largely intact, continuing to generate exports and employment while domestic demand collapsed. Harsh austerity measures, though socially painful, restored fiscal credibility and enabled Ireland to regain access to international bond markets by 2013. By 2015, Ireland had achieved the fastest economic growth in Europe, earning the nickname Celtic Phoenix for its remarkable recovery. Contemporary Ireland benefits from several structural advantages that position it well for future challenges. European Union membership provides access to the world's largest single market, while the English language and cultural ties to America facilitate continued foreign investment. Ireland's young, well-educated population contrasts sharply with aging demographics elsewhere in Europe, providing a competitive advantage in knowledge-based industries. The diaspora of 70 million people claiming Irish ancestry worldwide creates networks that support tourism, investment, and cultural exchange. Brexit has paradoxically strengthened Ireland's position within the European Union, as Dublin has become a preferred destination for financial services companies relocating from London. Major technology companies continue to expand their Irish operations, attracted by the country's role as a gateway to European markets and favourable tax treatment of intellectual property. Ireland's status as the only English-speaking country remaining in the EU after Brexit provides unique advantages for American and other international companies seeking European market access. However, modern Ireland faces significant challenges that test its adaptability and resilience. Climate change poses particular threats to a country where 40% of the population lives within 5 kilometres of the coast. Rising sea levels threaten coastal communities, while changing precipitation patterns affect agriculture and water supplies. Dublin faces increasing water shortages despite Ireland's reputation for abundant rainfall, forcing controversial proposals to redirect water from the Shannon River to serve the growing capital. The housing crisis represents perhaps the most visible failure of contemporary Irish policy, with house prices in Dublin rivaling those in London or Paris despite much lower average incomes. An entire generation of young Irish people finds itself priced out of home ownership, forced to pay exorbitant rents or emigrate to more affordable countries. The crisis reflects deeper problems with planning systems, construction capacity, and land development policies that have proven remarkably resistant to political solutions. Ireland's rapid urbanisation creates additional pressures on infrastructure and public services. Dublin's population has grown by 10% in the past decade alone, straining transport networks, schools, and hospitals built for much smaller populations. The concentration of economic activity in the Greater Dublin area creates regional imbalances that leave rural communities struggling with population decline and limited economic opportunities. Despite these challenges, Irish culture continues to thrive and evolve in the 21st century. The Irish language, though spoken daily by only a small minority in Gaeltacht regions, maintains symbolic importance and receives substantial state support. Bilingual signage throughout the country reflects official commitment to linguistic diversity, while Irish language schools in urban areas attract parents seeking to preserve cultural traditions in an increasingly globalised world. Traditional sports remain deeply embedded in Irish culture, with Gaelic football and hurling continuing to attract massive television audiences and passionate local support. The All-Ireland Championships each September represent genuine national festivals that transcend political and social divisions, while the county-based organisation of the Gaelic Athletic Association provides a sense of local identity and community belonging that resists modernising pressures. Irish literature maintains its extraordinary international reputation, with writers like Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, and contemporary authors like Sally Rooney achieving global success. The country's literary festivals, from the Dublin Writers' Festival to smaller regional celebrations, demonstrate the continued centrality of storytelling and verbal artistry in Irish culture. Traditional music sessions in pubs across the country keep ancient melodies alive, while inspiring new compositions and international appreciation. The modern Irish economy has diversified beyond its traditional dependence on agriculture and manufacturing to embrace service industries, technology, and financial services. The International Financial Services Centre in Dublin employs over 40,000 people in banking, insurance, and fund management, while the technology sector continues to expand with companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple maintaining significant Irish operations. Pharmaceutical manufacturing remains a crucial sector, with Ireland producing a substantial portion of the world's supply of essential medications. Tourism has become increasingly important to the Irish economy, with over 10 million visitors annually generating billions in revenue and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. The Wild Atlantic Way, stretching along the western coast, and the ancient East marketing initiatives have successfully promoted Ireland's natural beauty and historical heritage to international audiences. The success of cultural exports like Riverdance, U2, and numerous film productions has enhanced Ireland's global brand and cultural soft power. Irish cuisine has undergone a remarkable transformation from its historically limited repertoire to embrace international influences while rediscovering indigenous ingredients and traditions. Dublin and Cork now boast Michelin-starred restaurants, while artisan food producers throughout the country create products that compete internationally. The craft beer movement has exploded, with hundreds of small breweries challenging the traditional dominance of Guinness and offering consumers unprecedented variety and quality. The demographic profile of contemporary Ireland reflects both historical legacies and modern realities. The population remains relatively young compared to European averages, but declining birth rates and increasing life expectancy point toward future ageing challenges. Immigration has made Ireland significantly more diverse, with over 10% of residents now foreign-born, though integration challenges persist, particularly in working-class urban areas. Irish Catholicism, once the dominant force in national life, has experienced dramatic decline following clerical abuse scandals and rapid social change. Weekly mass attendance has fallen from over 90% in the 1970s to below 40% today, while referendums approving same-sex marriage in 2015 and abortion access in 2018 demonstrate fundamental shifts in social attitudes. The separation of church and state has accelerated, with Catholic influence over education and healthcare increasingly questioned and challenged. Looking toward the future, Ireland faces both opportunities and challenges that will test its capacity for adaptation and innovation. Climate change demands fundamental transformations in energy production, transportation, and agricultural practices. Ireland has committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050, requiring massive investments in renewable energy, electric vehicle infrastructure, and retrofitting of existing buildings for energy efficiency. The possibility of Irish unification, while still uncertain, has moved from the realm of aspiration to practical politics following demographic changes in Northern Ireland and Brexit's disruption of established relationships. The 2021 census showed Catholics outnumbering Protestants in Northern Ireland for the first time, while opinion polls suggest growing support for unification, particularly among younger voters. However, the economic, political and social challenges of integrating two different systems of government, education and healthcare would be enormous. Technological transformation offers both opportunities and risks for Ireland's future. Artificial intelligence, automation and digitalization could enhance productivity and competitiveness, but they also threaten traditional employment patterns and require substantial investments in education and retraining. Ireland's small size and flexible institutions provide advantages in adapting to technological change, but success will depend on maintaining the educational excellence and innovation capacity that enabled previous economic transformations. Ireland's unique position as a bridge between Europe and America, combined with its cultural assets and educated population, suggests reasons for optimism about its future. The country has demonstrated remarkable resilience in overcoming historical disadvantages and adapting to changing global circumstances, from the devastation of colonialism and famine through the struggles of early independence to the triumph of the Celtic Tiger and recovery from financial crisis. Ireland has repeatedly shown its capacity for reinvention and renewal. The Ireland of 2025 bears little resemblance to the impoverished, isolated country of a century ago, yet certain characteristics persist across the generations. The importance of family, community and place remains strong despite urbanization and globalization. The gift for language and storytelling continues to find new expressions in literature, media and digital communications. The ability to maintain cultural distinctiveness while embracing international influences represents a particularly Irish form of cosmopolitanism that may offer lessons for other small nations navigating globalization. As Ireland moves deeper into the 21st century, its greatest assets remain its people and their accumulated wisdom from centuries of adaptation to changing circumstances. The challenges of climate change, technological disruption, and demographic transition will require the same combination of pragmatism, creativity, and determination that enabled previous generations to transform challenge into opportunity. In this green island on the edge of Europe, the ancient and modern continue their complex dance, creating a unique civilization that bridges past and future, tradition and innovation, local identity and global engagement.